I wanted to tell you guys a story about Halloween. I have a couple good Halloween stories, and I wanted to tell you one of them this year, and then next year with Halloween, I hope to tell you the other one. Um, this year's Halloween story is about a guy that I met that I became attracted to, which is unusual for me. That's kind of part of that's kind of the biggest part of this story. Like, I'm not generally attracted to people. I'll say people because if I say men, it's like, okay, well, are you attracted to women? It's like, no, that would be easy. For me, attraction has never been a particularly easy thing. Um, I don't know how common that is. I know that people in my hometown, people that I associated with socially, it was a very easy thing for them. Like they would see a guy, they would look at him, they'd be like, he's attractive, he's hot, um, you know, he's got nice muscles or whatever. I don't know what it is that girls are actually attracted to in men sometimes. But for whatever reasons, this dude is hot and I'm attracted to him and that's it. It's that simple. I don't know why. Like, I get a lot of, I don't know why you're being so picky. And I do feel rather guilty for that because I feel as though I was being picky and it wasn't a voluntary decision on my part. I really wasn't trying to be picky. Um, I wasn't trying to reject the men that I rejected. I wasn't trying to, like, a lot of people look at hypergamy and they say, oh, well, women turn you down because they're looking for something better. And for me, I couldn't make myself feel those feelings. It wasn't happening. It wasn't. And I remember my first boyfriend, the catastrophe that was my first boyfriend was basically my attempt to make a relationship happen, to make attraction occur, to make myself feel these feelings that everybody else around me seemed to feel so easily and I seemed incapable of developing. Um, it it is unusual for me to become attracted to a man. It's not a common occurrence. It's very unusual. And I mean, obviously it happens sometimes because eventually I did get married. I did have kids. Um, and there were men along the way that I occasionally became attracted to. Um, it was just very infrequent. And this particular man, well, I thought I'd tell you the story about him. Um, I was at work one evening and I got a little bit of a headache. It was a slow night. I didn't want to be bothered. I just decided to call in sick. And I really don't know why because it was very uncharacteristic of me. Um, Headaches are unusual for me. I don't get headaches, but that day I did. And calling in sick for work just because of a headache was also unusual for me, but you know, that's what I did. I was on my way home and I realized I didn't want to hang out in an empty apartment all night, so I called up one of my friends who was a pickup artist. He was pretty much my only friend in that city. Like, I had moved out of my hometown to this city and he was a friend of mine. He lived in the same apartment complex and it was kind of good to have a person that I knew who, I guess is a friend. Um, and so I called him up and I was like, hey, can I come over and hang out at your place? Because I would do that a lot. I'd go over to his place and I'd hang out and I'd watch him hang out with his friends and they would all smoke weed. And I had this little corner of his living room that I would sort of take over and I would do my stretches there because I was a contortionist and so I was doing stretches. Um, and I'd listen to them. They would sit around and they'd smoke their weed and they'd talk to each other about whatever they were interested in. Mostly, it was their artistic aspirations, which it was not particularly interesting, I guess, but it was good to hear the sound of people's voices. Like, so that's what I would do. I would sit there in the corner. I hardly ever talked while I was there. I basically just listened to them talk and did my stretches and I don't know, enjoyed the presence of other human beings. So that was good. Um, so I went over to his house. Now, he warned me ahead of time there were people at his house or he had a company or over or whatever. And it wasn't a problem for him. And as long as it wasn't a problem for him, it wasn't a problem for me. I showed up at his house, apartment. Um, I walked in and you went through the door and there was a couch like right over here. And so I walked in and right away I noticed there was a man on the couch. Okay, so there was a dude on the couch. Um, he looked like a pretty ordinary dude, so I didn't really pay him much attention. I went over to my little corner and I sat down, and I can't remember if I started doing stretches right away or I just kind of sat down because that's where I was used to sitting. And that was my little, my spot. And my pickup artist friend is kind of doing introductions. This is so and so, so and so. This is Barbara. I'm like, hi, kind of wave at him. I was like, just so there's no confusion, I'm a stripper. And I had a club t-shirt, one of the t-shirts that the club handed out, underneath my sweater. And so I just sort of pulled my sweater up and like, here I am, I'm a stripper. Because I mean, it kind of makes things less awkward. Like, that's one of those things that if I'm actually going to be talking with somebody, especially back then when I wasn't, married and trying to behave in a socially acceptable way, like these days I'm meeting with other parents of kids that my kids are interacting with. It's not something that I want to be like blaring out to them like, hey, by the way, I worked as a stripper for 8 years. But back at that point in my life, I mean, that was what I did. And so it's like, if that's weird to you, might as well just get it out in the open now. It didn't seem particularly weird to this guy. He was just like, oh, okay, so that was good. And that was pretty much it. That's all I remember really at this point. The only notable stuff I remember really. My pickup artist friend had a friend of his who would come over and hang out with him quite often, who was actually an attractive man. So there are actually two men in this story that I was attracted to. And this guy was an artist, an aspiring artist, and he was, he was a decent guy, very pretty looking, and he really, really liked his freedom. So he was okay with friends with benefits kinds of stuff, but he wanted his freedom. He didn't want a committed relationship. He wanted to pursue his artistic aspirations, and so, it was fun to have around. He was definitely fun to have around. It was a good kind of pseudo relationship. I had broken up with my alcoholic boyfriend, and I hadn't found anybody else that was particularly special to me. So it was kind of nice having this pretty young man that would occasionally like come over to my apartment and hang out with me. He wasn't looking for anything particularly committed, and I was, but I wasn't gonna get with him, so it was just good to have someone around. Company. It's good to have company sometimes, I guess. Oh dear. I'm sure there's a better way to say that, but there you go. Anyway, this young artistic man was a smoker. And he got up at one point to go outside for a smoke, and I kind of, sidled out the door with him, just to spend a little time with him, try to talk with him, try to see if he was interested in coming by my apartment later, because that would be nice. And so I'm talking with him and chatting with him, and this new guy comes out, and he pulls out some cigarettes, and this new guy, he smoked like a grass fire, like. The artist guy, he had like a cigarette, he was done, he went back inside. I didn't know a way to follow him back inside that would not be kind of awkward and obvious, and so I hung out on the porch enjoying the beautiful weather with, this new guy who was like smoking cigarette after cigarette like there's no tomorrow. And he and I started talking, and you know what, he was actually pretty fun guy. He was a good conversationalist, which is nice because, when you're an exotic dancer, you kind of have to carry the conversation sometimes, which if you're a talker, that's good, but I'm not. And so it can be a little difficult, depending on the customer, depending on what we're talking about, depending on how drunk the customer is, it can be a little tricky. This guy was just a very fluid talker. He had a lot of interesting things to say. He made, very instantly, very engaging conversation, which was very fun. and he had a good sense of humor too. Like at some point he started cracking some jokes, and he had a very kind of cynical, dark sense of humor, but it wasn't like super dark. Like I've met some people where their humor is so dark that it's just depressing, or their jokes are so dark that they're not even funny anymore. And it's like at some point it stops being fun. At some point it's just dark and it's no longer humor. This guy had the balance just right, where it was like he would say something and it was witty and true to life, very real, and also, a little bit cynical and a little bit dark, but, humorous, actually humorous, which was nice. Um, and so that was good. It was fun to talk with somebody who was actually funny, somebody who could actually make me laugh, somebody who was actually entertaining to talk to. And so I'm talking to him and talking to him, and time is starting to pass, and he's, smoking cigarette after cigarette, and he's actually like, this is actually a pretty fun guy to talk to. And, he seemed like a rather intelligent guy as well. He was telling me, about some of the jobs he had. He was telling me about some of the things he'd done, some of the places he'd seen, some of the things he was interested in. It's like that when you meet a new person. You meet a person who's new, and you're kind of trying to feel each other out. And you've got all sorts of things in the backdrop of your life that you might be willing to share if you think you can get away with it with the other person. And so we were having that conversation, that initial getting to know you conversation, where it's like, well, he'd tell me at some point that he was interested in sci-fi, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm interested in sci-fi, so great, now that's a subject that we're mutually interested in that we can talk about. And it was like, you guys all know that conversation, but we had a lot of things. Well, he was interested in everything, so that made it really easy for me. This guy had a vast multitude of interests. My pickup artist friend, I guess, ran into him at a bar one evening. Pickup artist friend was kind of opinionated, and he was discussing the movie version of a sci-fi versus the book, and the merits of each with some random person at the bar. And I guess this guy just walked up to him and started discussing the sci-fi with him because he knew it, he recognized it, and he started talking about it. And so it was like, that's how they got to know each other. And that's also how this guy got invited over to the pickup artist's house. He did a lot of things though. It wasn't just sci-fi. He played the organ, which you don't really meet people who play the organ anymore, but this guy actually played the organ at one point. But then he had a head injury, and stopped playing after that because he had some I guess nerve damage. And I actually, he had recorded music that he had played, and I actually got to hear his recorded music that he had played at one point. He shared it with me. There was a point at which, like, I don't think it was that initial conversation, but in subsequent conversations, where I started to worry that maybe he was not telling me the truth. Like, you meet a guy after a point, you meet a person, and sometimes if they tell you too many things that seem a little too extraordinary, you start to kind of look at it and say, okay, are you for real, or are you just making up all this stuff to make yourself sound like some sort of badass? But I mean, I listened to him, and I'm a crazy person, so I listen to people's stories and I connect all the dots. And I do that just as a habit, a force of habit, unfortunately. And so if this story that you tell me lines up with this story over here, and it lines up with this story over here, and then it lines up with this story over here, I can pretty well count on all those stories threading together. And if there's cohesion there, I'll find it and I'll notice it. If there's a lack of cohesion there, I will also find it and notice it. So I have known people who have lied to me excessively. And I think they thought they were getting away with it because I can just smile and nod a lot. One person in particular just used to lie to me all the time, and it was like a puzzle. You just sit there and you watch them and you try to figure out where the truth is in all of the lies. And it's virtually impossible, because at some point, I think with some people, they lie so much, they can't even tell when they're lying anymore. And anyway, this particular guy wasn't lying. His stories always lined up. and I watched him very carefully because the more extraordinary his stories got, the more I felt like I had to keep an eye on that. Anyway, he and I, we had our first, conversation at my pickup artist friend's house. And the artist had gone home, and the pickup artist came out onto his porch where we were all hanging out, and he was like, "Hey, I'm throwing a party. Do you guys want to come? It's like on this day, whatever." And I'm not a party person. I don't go to parties. I don't have any business in parties. Like, when they do the little introvert questionnaire, are you an introvert or an extrovert? At parties, I generally, and it's like either, go out and talk to lots of people or sit by the wall and don't say much or talk to only a few close friends. At parties, I generally don't attend. But, this guy was like, oh, sure, yeah, I'll go. I mean, he had just moved to town, like roughly a month before, not even that, maybe. And so he was like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll go. And so, I was like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll go. Mostly I just wanted to talk to this guy again, and this seemed like a good way to do it. So that the day of the party comes along. I didn't know if this guy was going to be there or not. Parties really aren't my thing, but I figured, hey, I'll try it. What's the worst that can happen? If he's not there, I'll just go home. We live in the same apartment complex. I'll literally cross the parking lot and I'll be home. So I went to this party and I arrived a little bit earlier, actually just about on time. And I got in and this guy was there because he was I learned later that he was a very, I'm blocking on the word. Anyway, he was always on time for things. Like he's a very, that word's gonna bug me. Anyway, he was there and I came in, and since he was the only other guest at the party and the pickup artist was like preparing some drinks and getting like some ice and whatnot, the two of us sat down, started chatting, and we talked and we talked and we talked a bit more. Other guests started arriving. They all started hanging out, mingling. It was a pretty pleasant little party. I don't really know much of what went on because most of the time I was just hanging out with this guy and talking with him. He was a very interesting person. Like the more I talked with him, the more it was like, this is actually an interesting guy. I met at that point in my life, I met and flirted with men professionally. I talked with men professionally. Every night I went into work, I sat down and I talked with new men. And I got to know them and I talked with them about whatever they happened to be interested in. And I spent so many nights having what I would consider to be pretty boring conversations. I spent many, many nights talking with guys about things that they were interested in that I had absolutely no interest in. I spent many, many, many nights talking with guys who were not quite drunk or definitely drunk about how much they love hanging out and drinking and how that's fun for them, and it should be fun for me too. Except it isn't. So, I've had interesting conversations in strip clubs. I definitely have had interesting conversations in strip clubs, and those interesting conversations in strip clubs are what kept me going. But they're rare. It's rare for me to really have an interesting conversation with somebody I've just met. I'm sure that once you get to know a person really, really well, no matter how boring they might seem initially, once you finally get to know them past a certain point, then they start opening up and sharing all the interesting things with you. But I'm not particularly socially skilled, and so it has to be within easy reach for me to find it. Cat hair. I was holding the cat earlier, and I've got cat hair all over my face. He's sitting right there next to me and probably looking rather smug at the moment. No, I'm not particularly socially skilled. So if somebody's going to be interesting, they have to be interesting enough, close enough to the surface for me to really find it. And this guy was all levels of interesting. We were talking about we were talking about all sorts of things. We were talking about his playing the organ. We were talking about some of the music he composed. We were talking about some of the jobs he had. He would get a job, and I was actually able to observe this later on once I had gotten to know him better. This is the kind of guy who gets a job, and it's amazing to watch, really. He would get a job, and he'd be learning his new job, and he'd be happy. He'd be learning his new job, and a couple weeks, maybe a couple months in, he would, I don't know, he would look at it and he'd say, okay, I've learned enough about this job to realize that there are huge inefficiencies in the way this job was put together. And so I'm talking with my bosses right now to try and find a way to make the job more efficient. And so I'd see that happen. And then after a little while, it'd be like, well, I'm designing a new program to make my job run more efficiently so that things will be more smooth in this job. And then a little while after that, I'd talk with him and he'd be like, well, I put the new program into place and the job is running very smoothly and everything is going very smoothly. And I finished my work in like an hour and two. And now I don't have anything to do. And so I'm trying to find busy work to keep myself busy so that I actually have something to do while I'm at work. And then, you know, a little while after that, it's like, well, I'm looking for a new job. I'm too bored with this one. It's driving me nuts. I can't stand it. And I saw him do this like a few times. I mean, at this point in time, I you know, spoilers, I still know this guy. Right now he's working, as an entrepreneur with a bunch of other entrepreneurs, in finance, and basically, you know, he doesn't have to worry about punching a clock and working a set little pre-programmed job. Like, he just kind of, I mean, it's an entrepreneur. He goes out and he works, and he just works and works and works until there's no more work to do, or until he's worked for so long that it's time to take a break from the work. And that's what he does, and that's kind of who he is. He's much better suited to a more sort of free range workaholism. But yeah, it was always really funny to watch him when he would get these 9-to-5 jobs, these little scheduled jobs that he would do. Because when I met him, he didn't have a college degree. He has since obtained one, but at the time he didn't have one. And so he was, you know, what kinds of jobs can you get without a college degree? Well, at one point he was working in a grocery store, and at one point he was working in a mail room, and at one point he was working, like, you know, several different jobs. But when I first met him, he had already had several different jobs. And so, you know, I was talking with him, and my hair's gonna drive me nuts this evening. Yep. I was talking with him, and you know, I worked on an ambulance for a while, and so, you know, occasionally I worked with dead bodies. And he worked in a morgue for a little while, or not a morgue, mortuary, funeral services. He worked with them. And so he had some experience with dead bodies. And so the two of us are in the middle of this party. We're sitting on my little corner of the rug because somehow, I guess I gravitated over there, so he just sat down next to me. And we're talking. People are having this party around us that we're completely oblivious to, and we're telling each other stories about dead bodies that we've encountered at work, because both of us worked with dead bodies. And honestly, if you've worked with dead bodies, that's going to make sense to you, because, I don't know, it's common ground that you can share those stories with other people, and it's also the kind of stories you can't really share with folks. Like, you know, I have stories about dead bodies that I can't just kind of casually share with people. But if somebody I know has, like, worked with dead bodies before, it's like, hey, you know how, you know, and I'll go off on some detail about corpses that, you know, you just can't share with everyday people. So it was kind of nice. It was actually very refreshing to have a conversation like that with this guy. So we talked about corpses and organ music, and we talked about a lot of other things besides that. Like, we talked about, I can't even remember all the things we talked about. But anyway, at some point we noticed that the party was starting to wind down, and it was very late in the evening. And we had spent the entire evening just talking with each other. And so, since my apartment was literally just across the parking lot, I asked him to come over to my apartment, and we could just keep talking there. So he did. We went over to my apartment and we're hanging out in my living room. I introduced him to the cats because I had a handful of cats at that point in time. Um, and you know, he got along well with the cats, which was a good sign. That's always a good sign when you introduce somebody coming into your apartment to your animals, your small fluffy animals, and they're nice to your small fluffy animals. That's a good sign. So, you know, he was getting along well with the cats and we're hanging out, we're talking. Um, Again, I can't remember what all we talked about. Like, we just talked about so many things and we were bouncing all over the place because this guy was interested in all sorts of things. Like, he was interested in everything and he had done a lot. That was probably the most striking thing about him initially. Um, a young man, like, this guy was 26 when I met him. But yeah, a young man, early to mid 20s, when you talk to him, because again, I've talked to a lot of young men at work, um, they only have so many stories because they're young, you know. Um, they've only had the opportunity to do so many things. And so frequently, you know, you'll meet a guy, I'll be like, well, I graduated from high school and I joined the military. I graduated from high school and I went to college for, you know, X, Y, or Z. I graduated from high school and I, you know, got a job right away. Went into some trade or some career. Sometimes you'll find a guy who dropped out of high school and then what did they do from there? Um, they don't have that many stories. Some of them do, but not many, and even then, not many stories. It's like I've only had so much time in my life at this point to do so many things, and so I've done like 2 or 3 interesting things in my life, and that's really all I've had the chance to do. And so I mean, I've kind of gotten used to that with men. Like, that's very, very normal, and it's not unhealthy. I mean, seriously, you only have 365 days in a year. What are you going to do with that time? There's only so much that you can do, and there's only so much you can accomplish. And so young men don't have many very exciting stories. This guy had very many exciting stories. He had traveled around in Europe for a while. He'd had all these different jobs and he kept getting new jobs because he kept getting a little too bored at the jobs that he would get, so he would find new ones and he would try to, you know, he was constantly trying to raise up the job hierarchy as he was doing this, you know, shopping around for a new job. Okay, that's better, and just let's upgrade and upgrade and upgrade because, you know, it's boring. Um, he was a very intelligent man. And so, I mean, I can appreciate this a little bit. I'm not as smart as this guy is, but I can appreciate the need for constant, just mental stimulation. And so, you know, if you have a job, and I had a desk job at one point in my life. I've technically had a desk job, and it was when I was in college. I was working in the writing center as a tutor, an English tutor, which is really funny because I was a freshman. I was working as an English tutor in the writing center at my college. Um, I I quickly grew to hate that job. I would clock in and then I would have to sit around in the writing center just waiting for someone to show up. And I felt like I didn't have a job and I was so happy when I quit. Like, I was trying to pad my resume and that's why I was doing it, because it looked good, and I hated it so much, which is basically my experience of college in a nutshell. It looked good, but I hated it. And it didn't even look that good. I was in a local college, like in the middle of nowhere, like rural prairie nowhere college. It didn't even have a fancy name attached to it, and I was doing it, and it was not worth my time, and it was expensive, and you know, again, not worth my time. Um, but yeah, this guy, very intelligent guy, got bored easily. Needed to constantly be, you know, needed to constantly be running to feel like he was satisfactorily employed. Um, which meant that he did a lot. Um, One of the things about him, one of the first things I noticed, you know, just to give you an idea of what this guy looked like, he was a little too thin. He was very lean, very wiry, very, whipcord kind of guy. His cheeks were a bit sunken, a little too thin, and he had these dark circles under his eyes, just black circles under his eyes. He looked like he had bruises, like just deep, dark bruises. And his eyes were very bright and very sharp and very alert. Not unhealthily so, like not like crazed eyes, but, just focused and alert and sharp, and he didn't miss anything. Which is why I've thought of him for a long time in my stories. Like I was trying to compose like all these stories about my life as an exotic dancer, and he was always just, nobody goes by their real name. So for him, he was always just the wolf-eyed man, or the man with the wolf's eyes, because that's what he had. He had wolf eyes. They were actually quite gorgeous. I'm not gonna lie. And which is kind of where I'll stop talking about this guy so much and just start talking about the point at which I realized I might be attracted to him. That came after a couple weeks. So skip forward a couple weeks. He was coming over to my apartment pretty much all the time because he just moved to town, so he didn't really know anybody. So he would come over to my apartment to hang out, and we would just sit and talk and talk and talk. And every once in a while we go out into my porch, and he just chain smoke like a chimney. And then we go back into my apartment and we talk some more. And I mean, I don't know when he slept, because he had to go to work during the day. And then after he got off work, he'd come over to my apartment and hang out with me. We'd talk all night. And I think that's partially where the bruised eyes came from. I think he was sleeping like, what, 2 to 4 hours a night or something crazy like that. And I stopped going into work. Like for a month, I was just like, well, I've saved up a little bit of money. I don't really need to go to work right now. So I just stopped going. And I would sleep while he was at work, and then he would get off work and he'd come over and we'd sit around and we'd talk all night. 2 weeks in, I noticed that I was starting to notice his eyes, and you know what I mean when you notice a person, like not just, oh, okay, that's Bob sitting over there. It's like, oh, that's Bob. Okay. Started noticing his eyes, just the eyes. They were very sharp, very, very attractive eyes. So it was like, okay, this is the time where I have to sit down and have a very firm talk with myself. You know how all this plays out. This is a friend. You have a friend, and he's an interesting friend, and you enjoy talking with this friend. You spend many, many hours talking with this friend. You don't have many friends, and you definitely don't have any people in your life other than this guy that you can sit down and just talk about anything you're interested in with. That doesn't happen. So here's how this is going to go down, girly. You are not going to sleep with this man, because if you sleep with him, you know what's going to happen. One of two things. You're going to find out that he's not as awesome as you think he is, and you're going to break up with him, and that's going to be the end of your wonderful friendship with this very interesting guy that you get to have these wonderful conversations with. Or he's not going to want to stay in a relationship with you for some reason or another, and you're going to break up, and then you're not going to be able to have these wonderful conversations with this very interesting guy. So, either way, if this relationship becomes, kind of a dating relationship, you can kiss these wonderful conversations with this very interesting guy goodbye. So we're not going to do that. And I mean, I promised myself right then and there, we are not going to let this relationship become romantic, because I need these conversations in my life. Like, this is the most interesting, engaging person that I think I've ever met in my entire life. I need to have these conversations with someone. I need to be able to talk about things that I think are interesting, and have interesting conversations, and have conversations that leave me feeling fulfilled and satisfied mentally. Because up until that point, I swear I was just running around inside my own head, gnawing at anything that I could get my hands on, and just wishing that I could find somebody who could talk to me. Like, and I know that a lot of that is just my lack of social skill and my upbringing, which was I don't know how traumatic it really was, but I mean, ah, but I mean, I just didn't have people that I felt like I could really talk to. Like I had all these ideas and thoughts and things that I'd read and things that I was interested in, just running around inside my head like a constant like hamster on a wheel. No way to let it out, no one to talk to, no one to vent any of this stuff that was inside my head. And that's important. You need to have people in your life to talk to. And so I finally found one. It was like, okay, no matter what, do not let this become a romantic relationship or it will ruin everything. So, 2 weeks in, I noticed the eyes. I resolved to not let this become romantic. And I have some willpower. I have willpower. No, really, I do. um, I think it was about a week after that I had to finally go back to work because I had been skipping out on work for forever so that I could hang out with him more. Um, and eventually I noticed that I had to pay my bills, and so I was like, okay, I got to go to work. And so, he needed to sleep because I don't know when he slept, like at all. Like this guy didn't sleep. He was nocturnal. Um, it was he didn't sleep during the day either. Like he just didn't sleep. And so I went to work, and this guy finally got some rest. And I was at work and I was doing my usual, circling around the club looking for, innocent victims. And I started thinking about him. Like, just thinking about him, missing him, thinking about those eyes again. And it's like, oh, crap, okay, so it's one thing when you notice that they're attractive, but now you're thinking about that person. That's the next step. We know where this is progressing. You can't do this. Um, and so then I'm giving myself a very firm, lecture inside the club, inside my own head. I'm not like talking to myself or anything, but it's like, girl, you've got to put the brakes on this somehow. It, because there is a process. You start the romantic relationship, something goes wrong. Either you're not willing to continue the relationship in a romantic way, or they're not willing to continue the relationship in a romantic way, or maybe eventually he just finds somebody else that he was more into or whatever, and the romantic side of the relationship falls apart, and then everything gets weird because they don't want to continue having these conversations with you now that they've had the sex with you. And it's like, okay, I can't let this happen. I cannot let this happen. But I mean, I was starting to notice him more and more, and it was starting to get a little bit distracting. Like I noticed the eyes, and then I noticed the eyebrows, which honestly, to date, I will say this with complete honesty, he has the most beautiful eyebrows of any human being, male or female, that I have ever seen in my entire life. Like, they're gorgeous. They're perfect. And I don't know how that happened. It was just one of the blessings of nature right there. Really, really striking eyes, wolf's eyes, just amazing eyes, really amazing eyebrows. He had a nice jawline too. I was starting to notice that a little bit. Nice jawline, nice cheekbones, good nose. Okay, he had a very handsome face. I'll admit it. There was that. And the more I'm noticing these things, the more I'm thinking, well, shoot. Okay, well, as long as I've got self-control. So as long as I just hold on to that self-control, we'll keep things in neutral territory. He never ever needs to know how I feel about him. By the way, I ought to mention he doesn't know I'm making this video, so there's that. He never watches my videos though, so we're good. But yeah, like he as long as he doesn't know that I'm attracted to him, we're good. We can keep having our conversations. We can keep being friends. Everything's going to be okay. At one point he was telling me we were talking about sunsets at one point. Where I come from, there's not much beauty, like not much natural beauty. Like there's a little bit, and some people find it beautiful. I was really funny because I talked to a friend of mine at one point who traveled to the area I grew up in, and they took all these pictures because they're a photographer, and they took all these pictures and they were showing me these pictures of, the place I had come from, that they were like, oh, I loved the lighting on this, and I loved this this scene, and you can see the hills and, you know, the grass and the wheat and all this. And they're showing me this, and it's my backyard. Like literally, I mean, it's just pictures of my backyard, and I mean, it all looks exactly the same to me. But they were captivated by the natural beauty of the place. And I mean, it's wild land, so there's a lot of natural beauty out there. But I just don't find it particularly beautiful, like most of the time. Like there are moments when my home environment is captivatingly beautiful, and then the rest of the year it just looks awful. But several of those moments occur either at sunrise or sunset because it's big sky country and the vistas are just extraordinary. So, you know, I mentioned to him, like I was telling him about where I came from. I was like, well, it's not very pretty out there, but I will say, I will admit, in all honesty, the sunsets and the sunrises are just amazing. And so he was telling me about the sunsets he had seen in Greece because he had gone to Greece because he was like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Dos Equis commercial, the old Dos Equis commercial with the most interesting man in the world. Well, imagine the most interesting man in the world as a young man who's like done a bunch of interesting stuff. That was this guy. And so at some point he calls me up. I think we had been talking, like just hanging out and talking for about 4 weeks at that point. He calls me up and he's like, hey, I found this place that has awesome sunsets and you really haven't seen a sunset since you moved here. Let's go see a sunset together. You know, it's this old historical place. We can go look at it and see this sunset and it'll be cool. And I was like, yeah, that sounds good. So we went out to watch the sunset together. You know how sunsets are supposed to be like really romantic? I I just didn't think about that because I'm stupid. I didn't really put two and two together and realize that it might actually be incredibly romantic to be standing alone with this guy on a hilltop, watching the sunset over the trees and just, yeah, it was quite beautiful. I mean, he was right. It was very beautiful. Um, what was I saying about self-control? Yeah, okay, well, we'll pretend I just didn't say that, shall we? Um, yeah. So that was our first date. And we went back to my apartment afterward because that was kind of our hangout spot. He didn't have an apartment yet. He had moved in, he'd come into town, he was staying with some relatives, and he hadn't found an apartment yet. And so we went back to my apartment and we started talking about how many kids we wanted to have together. That was 9 years ago. And I know it was 9 years ago because the next morning we went out for breakfast at this place that we would go hang out at, like for meals. And the waiter there, she had these little earrings with witches on them. And I remember looking at them and, you know, admiring them. They were pretty and they were festive. And then it took us a little while to realize that it was Halloween. And that we had spent like an entire month just hanging out and talking with each other. And in that month, Halloween had come and we had completely missed it. We had missed out on all the decorations, all the commercials, all the, all the stuff that lets you know that Halloween is coming, the radio, the TV, the, going to the grocery store and seeing Halloween decorations everywhere, like all of it, we'd missed it because we were so busy just hanging out and talking with each other. In case you haven't figured it out already, or in case I haven't made it clear enough, I married him. That was 9 years ago today. And that's how we know. Like, we know when our first date was because we discovered the very next morning that it was Halloween. He still has really beautiful eyes. He doesn't have the dark circles quite so much anymore. He's finally started getting sleep at night, and we've had many adventures together. It definitely has not been boring. Like we were talking about it just earlier tonight. It's been a very action-packed 9 years, and it's been a good time. But like I said, there aren't many stories about me being attracted to a guy, but this guy, this guy I'm attracted to. Anyway, I hope you all have a happy Halloween, and I will talk to you guys later.